Well, this is a perfect time to talk about sleep, and I must say that I went through my entire life bragging about how little I slept. And you could tell because if you ever saw me at the opera, you would know that I've been sleep deprived. and so what I decided to do, of course, was to learn more about my sleep. I bought one of those Fitbits, and I wore it for about 2 weeks, and I never slept worse. And the reason was that I'd go to bed, I'd put it on, and then about 2 in the morning I'd wake up to see if I was sleeping. But lack of sleep is something we bragged about. But what we're going to talk about tonight, which is so important and really so exciting to have such an extraordinary panel, is the fact that we know that lack of sleep isn't good for us, but we really do not understand this whole emerging field of sleep medicine and the potentially profound impact that disturbed sleep patterns have, not just on our brains, but on our entire cardiovascular system, on our appetite, the way we metabolize food, whether or not we put ourselves at greater risk for developing dementia. All of these things are new and early and exciting. And I have first Dr. Russell Morton. Dr. Morton is a PhD electrophysiologist of the brain, what's called a neuroelectrophysiologist. But what his specialty is, and the reason it's so important that he's here tonight, is that he can take that basic information and make it so that you can understand it, because it is so complex now, but so exciting to read about and hear about that he's going to help us with that. Now, Dr. Lisa Kuchen is an expert in the area of sleep medicine. She's a family practice doctor who works in the Department of Internal Medicine. And and many of you may not know this, but sleep medicine is a specialty. And I spoke to one of the Albuquerque Academy graduates, Dr. John Cronin, today about this, and as I've talked to them, it is a very important field. And she's going to talk to you about the potentially profound effects that disturbed sleep, the disturbances of our circadian rhythm, can have in terms of potentially being a disease-causing problems. And Dr. Shanna Diaz is also a Department of Internal Medicine at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, is also a speech specialist, and she came another way. She is boarded in geriatrics and also boarded in psychiatry. So she brings a different perspective, but what she's going to tell you, if you're still awake at the end of this discussion, what she's going to tell you is what you can do to have good sleep health. So with that, I'd like to have Dr. Morton come up and talk and introduce him. It's our pleasure.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ramo, for that great introduction, your kind words. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate you guys all making the effort to come out tonight. As Dr. Ramo mentioned, my name is Russell Morton. I'm a research assistant professor at the University of New Mexico in the Health Sciences Department and the Department of Neurosciences. Now, I think we can all agree that sleep is important. You probably wouldn't have taken time out of your busy schedules to come listen to us talk about sleep if you didn't. But amazingly enough, we actually sleep about 1/3 of our life. What does that mean, really? Well, if we live to the age of 80, that means we actually are asleep for 26 years of our life. So why is sleep so important? Well, sleep is actually essential to life. It's just as essential as food and water. It's so essential that every animal on this planet sleeps in one way, shape, or form. Even single cellular organisms, such as this algae, regulate their genes in a 24-hour cycle. So why is Sleep's so important. Well, are there any parents here tonight? Great. Well, then you know exactly how it feels when you're sleep deprived. Let me introduce you to this little monster. This is my daughter, Esme. When my wife and I finally got pregnant, we were very excited, but we were also really, really nervous. My wife and I were both scientists. We aren't qualified to be parents. What do we know about keeping a baby alive? Nothing, right? So we started to read all sorts of books about babies and how to keep them alive and all these things. But of course, we didn't finish all those books before Esme came. Esme arrived about a month early. She was a little small. We didn't know any better. We thought all babies were small. But the doctors were actually really worried about her weight. So my wife and I fed Esme constantly. And as all you parents know, these new babies like to eat about every 45 minutes. That's during the day and during the night. That doesn't actually allow for a whole lot of sleep. So exactly. That's my daughter. So about a week or two in, we actually felt like these guys. Not only did we physically hurt, I remember one night my wife looked at me and says, "My hair hurts. Is that even possible?" We noticed that we could no longer remember anything. We couldn't remember the things we read in the baby books. It got to the point where we started to keep detailed notes of every time we fed Esme, how much she ate, when we changed her diaper. And if it wasn't for these detailed notes, we couldn't tell you what happened 20 minutes ago. So why is this? Why is sleep so important? Well, from a neuroscientist perspective, I'm going to tell you about 3 things that happen to your brains only when you sleep. And the first thing we're going to talk about tonight is the activity of our brain. Now, we lie in our beds and are relatively still, right? So we're physically resting. But are our brains resting? What is going on up there? It seems like our brains actually just flip a switch and turn off, right? But do they really turn off and rest? Well, it wasn't until the 1950s when scientists first had the ability to record the electrical activity of brains. And they did this by attaching electrodes to the surface of the scalp. And then if they did this when patients were awake, they would see something like this. These sharp peaks and troughs represent that electrical activity in your brain while you're awake. Now, much like most of you and me at the time, right? We thought, well, this probably just gets really quiet, right? The brain must quiet itself down, and that line is going to become very, very flat. But they found the exact opposite of that. What they found was when the patients began to be a little drowsy, those peaks and troughs actually got a little bit bigger. And as the patients actually fell asleep, those peaks and troughs got very, very large. Our brain is clearly not resting. It's incredibly active. They actually noticed one specific stage of sleep that the brain activity actually looks very similar to the brain activity when they're awake. So what does all this activity mean when it comes to energy? It must take a lot of energy to do all of this. Well, our brains are about 2% of our total body mass. But they're responsible for about 20% of our metabolism. So what does that exactly mean in terms of calories? Well, if we sit at a desk all day long for 8 hours, like many of us do, unfortunately, we burn about 820 calories. Now, if we spend 8 hours asleep, and our brain is doing all that activity, we actually burn about 670 calories. That's only a difference of about 150 calories. That's really not very much. It's almost the equivalent of a hot dog bun. That's not a lot of calories. So what the heck is our brain doing with all this activity? You remember when I said when my wife and I were so deeply sleep deprived, we couldn't remember a single thing. It's because we weren't sleeping. Here's an example of a student studying so hard to understand the principles of calculus. She's contemplating to herself, I could stay up all night and I might learn this material a little bit better, right? Or she could possibly sleep a little bit. We've all had this argument. Should I sleep? Should I try to get more work done? Get one more thing done to check off my list at night? But we want to know what's happening to the brain when someone tries to learn calculus or anything else. Now, we can't exactly look into the brain of this student while she's studying calculus, right? So we have to use animals to help understand how we learn. So we can't exactly teach mice calculus, but we can take advantage of the fact that mice like to run, and they like to run a lot. And so what we can do is we can place these animals on these rotating rods, and those rods begin to rotate faster and faster. These animals, with some trial and error, start to learn to balance themselves on these rods and stay running on these rods longer and longer. Now, if we allow those animals to sleep and then do the exact same thing the following day, what we notice is that their performance is actually better. Makes sense, right? They practiced this the day before, so their performance should get better. But if we disrupt their sleep and then try this thing again, their performance is no better than it was the day before. There's something that happens while we sleep that makes them perform better the next day. So in the mice, we can actually look into their brains as they're doing this behavior. And what we notice is that certain brain cells are very, very active during this time when they're running on the rod. If we look at these same brain cells a few hours after the initial training, what we notice is that these brain cells actually physically change and make more connections with each other. And it's these new connections that actually help that behavior the next day. Now, the second most amazing thing that I'm going to tell you tonight is that if we look at these cells and we then allow those animals to sleep, the same cells that were active during this behavior were then reactivated. They're actually replaying those events of this behavior while we sleep. And it's the replaying of this behavior that actually strengthens those new connections. And then if we look at these cells the next day, those connections are maintained, helping him to improve the behavior. But now, if we disrupt that single phase of sleep, when those cells reactivate and replay that behavior, if we interrupt just that period of sleep, we actually block that behavior. They perform just as well as they did before. It's no better than the previous day. If we look back at those cells, we actually see that they lose those connections. If we block that react-to-play or replay of those cells, we block those new connections, and the performance suffers. So I think we've all heard the old saying, we should probably sleep on it. Well, after what I just showed you, I think we all agree that maybe we should sleep on it, right? Something does actually happen while we sleep. Our brains physically change while we sleep. So the last thing, one amazing thing I want to tell you about is how our brains actually bathe themselves. Yes, bathe themselves, just like a bathtub. So we've known for a while that our brains actually sit in a fluid that we call cerebral spinal fluid. Here what I'm showing you is a cross-section of the skull and the brain, and this blue part here is representative of that cerebral spinal fluid. Now it's thought that the cerebral spinal fluid helps remove metabolites and excess proteins from our brain and helps get rid of those. But a few years ago, a group of scientists wanted to understand how well do those metabolites and those excess proteins get removed in deep parts of the brain. So to do this, they actually injected a yellow dye into the cerebral spinal fluid, in mice, of course. And then they actually used a very fancy microscope and imaged these deep parts of the brain. And so to help them orient themselves, they actually labeled the brain vasculature here in blue, and then looked for the presence of that yellow dye. And what they saw, or in this case didn't see, was when the animal was awake, they actually couldn't see much of that dye getting down deep into the brain. Now this was much different when the animal fell asleep. What they saw was that this cerebral spinal fluid rushed into the brain like a wave. Now it's this wave of cerebral spinal fluid that helps wash away those metabolites and those excess proteins in these deep regions of the brain. One of those proteins, excess proteins, that gets removed during this process is a protein that you may have heard of called amyloid beta. Now, amyloid beta has been associated, the buildup of amyloid beta has been associated with Alzheimer's disease. And if you're not sleeping properly, you don't get this wave of activity, you don't remove that excess amyloid beta protein, and you can build up over time. The other important metabolite that is removed during this process is called adenosine. Adenosine actually has a few really important functions in our brain. Adenosine is a metabolite of most of the energy usage of our brain. When our brains are active, learning new things that you may be doing during the day, or listening to someone go on and on about sleep, this adenosine is building up, and it builds up all day long. And that buildup of adenosine is actually what we call the sleep pressure. It's actually telling your brain that you've been awake for a while, and you should probably start thinking about getting some sleep soon. Now, the second thing that adenosine does is it actually is a braking system for our brain. It actually slows the activity of our brain to help us transition to that sleeping mode. Now, without this washing of our brain, we don't remove the adenosine, we don't remove those excess proteins, and our brains physically don't function as well without this bathing. So as all of you parents know, those sleepless nights don't last forever, thankfully. This is my daughter Esme now, who's just over a year old. She sleeps well through the night, which we are very thankful for. My wife and I can now be active again and exercise. We remember those things that we read now. But more importantly, we get to enjoy our fantastic daughter. Now, I know some of you may laugh. I know some of our friends laugh at us. But we take bedtime very serious in our household. And we actually have a term for this, and we call it activating sleep mode. And we take it very serious, and it helps all of us sleep a little bit better. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to listen to us talk about this. I now want to turn the floor over to my colleague Lisa, who's going to talk more about what happens to our health if we don't get the proper sleep. Thank you.
Is this? Yes, it's on. Okay. Thank you. Okay, my name is Lisa Kuchen. I'm a sleep doctor at the University of New Mexico Sleep Disorders Center. And every day I give people advice on how to sleep longer and better. But I have a little confession, which is that I don't get enough sleep myself. But I know that I am in good company with you, my fellow short sleepers, because we know that 65% of us don't get the recommended 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night. And that's not just here in the United States, that is a problem in all developed countries. In fact, the World Health Organization calls this society-level lack of sleep an epidemic. Epidemic, that's a strong word from the World Health Organization. Could it be that inadequate sleep has consequences for our health? So why don't we get enough sleep? Well, we're overscheduled, overextended, burning the candles at both ends. And some of us are night owls, and we are trying to live on a schedule that conflicts with our own circadian rhythm. Now, why is it that some people can just fall asleep at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and other people can't fall asleep until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning? Well, it turns out that those bedtimes and wake times that are hardwired into our brains, that is a genetic trait that we inherit from our parents the same way we inherit the color of our eyes. And in fact, these 3 gentlemen won the Nobel Prize in Medicine last year for identifying the genes that determine our circadian rhythm and figuring out how they work. So, you know, sort of an average, typical circadian rhythm, we might call it, is this, where somebody goes to bed at 10 o'clock at night and gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then they have this peak level of alertness before noon. But if you take someone who is a night owl, their brain is not ready to fall asleep until well after midnight, 2 or 3 in the morning even, and then they need to sleep until 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, maybe even noon. And their high level of alertness for the day is in the afternoon. So if you're a night owl, you might be setting a clock, an alarm, to get up at 6 or 7 in the morning so that you can get to work by 8 o'clock, and in so doing, you're sacrificing valuable sleep, and that later has consequences for your health. Now, some people don't know that they're night owls. They don't know that their brain is programmed to fall asleep at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and they think they have insomnia. And they want sleeping pills so that they can fall asleep at 10 o'clock like everybody else. And they try to do that, but it's actually very hard to medicate away your own circadian rhythm. And some people aren't night owls, but they pretend to be, and they stay up late burning the midnight oil, and then they use caffeine to get through the next day, and they say, I'll sleep when I die. I'll sleep when I die. No, 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 it's more like I'll die if I don't sleep. Because inadequate sleep has serious adverse effects on almost every system in our body, including the cardiovascular system, endocrine system. It increases your risk of developing or of having a heart attack or a stroke or diabetes or succumbing to an infectious disease or developing dementia or memory problems, mood disorders, even cancer. In fact, if you sleep less than 6 hours a night on a regular basis, like some of us do, that actually doubles your risk of developing cancer. That's a little scary. And why is that? Well, probably has something to do with inflammation. Inflammation is a common theme among all these disease states. And we know that inflammation is bad because it made the cover of Time magazine in 2004. The secret killer. But what is inflammation? The way I think about inflammation is that it is the body's first line of defense against threat, okay? So let's say you stub your toe and get a break in your skin. Well, there's somewhere that germs can come in, right? And that's a threat to the body. So the body sends out its army of inflammatory chemicals and cells and fights off the potential infection. And then you end up with something that looks red and swollen and hurts. Because the problem with inflammation is that it takes no prisoners. Inflammation fights to the bitter end. And it doesn't just kill the invading germs, it does a fair amount of tissue damage to our bodies, as you can see on this poor toe. So, okay, well, why does inadequate sleep cause inflammation? Well, the reason is because sleep is not a luxury as we often think of it. Sleep is absolutely vital to our survival, so inadequate sleep is truly a threat to the body. Okay, now I've been pretty focused here on inadequate sleep, but I don't want to just focus on quantity of sleep. I also want to talk about sleep quality. And specifically, I want to talk about obstructive sleep apnea, which is probably the number one diagnosis that I see in the office. So obstructive sleep apnea is when you stop breathing during sleep because your airway is closed off or obstructed. In this example, you know, it's there at the back of the throat. That's usually where the obstruction is. And it makes it very difficult to breathe, so that sometimes people actually stop breathing entirely or work very hard to get what turns out to be an inadequate breath. Now, you may think you have sleep apnea because you have experienced this, the stare sign, right? Waking up with someone looking at you, wondering if you're going to start breathing again. But actually, we formally diagnose obstructive sleep apnea with a sleep study where we monitor several different parameters of sleep all at the same time. And one of them is oxygen. And this is an example of an oxygen tracing from a sleep study. This is about 7 hours worth of someone's oxygen recording compressed into this one picture. And this blue line at the top, that's the oxygen level. These numbers over here show you the oxygen saturation. In this case, this is a pretty normal oxygen line, and it's between 90% and 100% where it should be. But you can see that even going all the way down to here, you know, sometimes we measure oxygen down into the 50s. Now, a normal oxygen level, the reason this oxygen level looks so pretty like a piece of dental floss is because normal oxygen levels vary within a very narrow frame. So, you know, you record oxygen all night long like this, and it varies very slightly, and we compress it into a picture, and it looks like that. But in the case of obstructed sleep apnea, well, in that case, we stop breathing, and so the oxygen level drops drastically. The brain doesn't like that. It wakes you up and tells you to breathe. The oxygen recovers, and then that happens again. So you get this very wide picture of the oxygen, and you compress 7 hours of that, and you get a picture that looks more like a toothbrush, not dental floss. Now, if you look at that picture, notice that this person has very severe obstructive sleep apnea. And look how much of the night they're spending with their oxygen level below 90%. And that is absolutely abnormal for our bodies. Now, I want you just to have a slight sense of what it might be like to have obstructive sleep apnea. And again, that is when we try to breathe in through a closed airway. And we can mimic that while we're awake just by closing the mouth and plugging the nose and trying to breathe in, okay? So I'll tell you when to do this, but what I'm going to have you do, don't do it yet. I'll tell you. Of course, you have to breathe out first, then make sure your mouth is closed because no cheating, and then plug your nose and try to breathe in, and really, really try to breathe in, okay? All right, so breathe out, plug your nose. I'll count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's enough. Whew. Yeah, that'll make you sick. So, did you feel your blood pressure climbing just a little bit? Maybe your heart rate starting to increase? A little bit of panic setting in? You know, obstructive sleep apnea is a really good way to practice being anxious all night long. It actually triggers a fight or flight response. I mean, when you have obstructive sleep apnea, it's like you're running from a bear all night long. Well, a couple of points. Number one, clearly you can see why obstructive sleep apnea impacts the quality of your sleep. But also it impacts the quantity of your sleep because you are waking up over and over all night long, even if you don't remember it. So it impacts the brain. The good news is that we can treat obstructive sleep apnea with something called continuous positive airway pressure, or the initial CPAP, we just call it CPAP. And this is a picture of somebody who was put on CPAP in the middle of the night. Look at that oxygen level. It's normal because the airway is open. The air pressure holds the airway open and you can breathe. And now this is a person whose brain can sleep. And because it's Brain Awareness Week, I just want to just reiterate a little bit those points that Russ talked about with the brain. So remember, sleep is a time when your brain takes a bath, and during the day we have this buildup of metabolites, and at night they get washed away. But if you don't sleep enough, then they don't wash away well enough, and they begin to accumulate. And that causes problems. The same way that your hot water heater can break out after enough hard water deposits accumulate there. Your hot water heater will break down on you. And so there is this link between sleep and dementia. But you know, sometimes there's another link with dementia, or what we are sometimes afraid of might be dementia, which is memory, when you're just trying to remember that thing, and it will not come to you, and you think, oh my gosh, I am losing my memory. But again, as Russ showed us, sleep is the glue that makes memories stick. So if you're not sleeping enough, that may be the cause of your memory problems. And this isn't just true for adults, this is true for everyone. This is true for children whose job it is to learn and remember things, right? So how much sleep do children need? Well, school-age children need like 10 to 11 hours of sleep a night. And as they get older and enter adolescence, that sleep need declines somewhat to about 9.5 hours. But another thing is happening as we enter adolescence, which is that developmentally, it's very normal, we become night owls. We develop a delayed sleep phase of 1 to 3 hours. The brain in an adolescent is typically ready to fall asleep about 11 o'clock at night. And I'm just going to step up on my little soapbox here for a minute and say, this is a crazy thing that we do to our adolescents. Because as kids enter high school, we make their school start times earlier and earlier at the very same time that their brain wants to fall asleep later and later. And then we send them to school and expect them to learn and be happy about it. But, little problem, sleep also impacts the prefrontal cortex, this part of our brain right here, that helps us modulate strong emotions and helps us make good decisions. And it is powered by sleep. And if we don't get enough sleep, the prefrontal cortex just goes offline. So then it's not there, for example, to tell you, hey, you're too tired to get in this car and drive. And that's not something that just affects adolescents. I mean, that's something that affects all of us, right? One of the ironies about inadequate sleep is that we lose the ability to know that we're inadequately slept. We lose the judgment that says to us, your performance is not as good as it should be, and don't try to do this. It's almost like we become blind to the effects that sleep deprivation has on us. So, it bears mentioning, I do want to say this, there are school districts in the country that have experimented with delaying their school start times to 8, even 9 o'clock, like high school start times to 8 and 9 o'clock. And those school districts see significant improvements in achievement test scores, and they also see drastic reductions in the motor vehicle accident rates of their students. I'm talking 50 to 70% reductions in accident rates. So, you know, sometimes I wonder, what would I be giving up if I slept more? But that's really the wrong way to go about this. We shouldn't think about what we stand to lose by sleeping more. We should think about what we stand to gain by sleeping more. And actually, there are some really simple things that we can do to improve our sleep, both quantity and quality. And my colleague, Shanna Diaz from the university, is going to talk to us about that. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to be here tonight.
I'm going to see if my mic works. Can everyone hear me okay? Give me some thumbs down if you're either bored or my mic's not working. I'll come get another one. So thank you, Lisa, for that introduction, and thank you all again for coming tonight. It's great to see you all still awake. That's awesome. So, you know, I want to start off talking about some good sleep. How do we do that? But first, I'd like to take a little poll of people. I would like to see a show of hands for the people that get to sleep pretty easily, and they think they sleep pretty well at night, not waking up and staying up too much. And you're getting up in the morning without an alarm. But where's the hands? Okay, we have some potentially good sleepers here. Every morning, what about on the weekends? Are you sleeping in on the weekends a little bit, more than an hour? If you meet all those conditions, maybe I will believe that you have pretty good sleep. You might still find a few things that we can tweak to make it a little better. Because really, like Lisa pointed out, it's sometimes really tricky to tell we have sleep problems. And on the other hand, some of us know we have sleep problems because we have symptoms of sleep problems. Well, Lisa pointed out that as sleep doctors, we see and treat sleep apnea the most. But as far as healthcare providers in general, if you ask them, the most common complaint that they hear related to sleep is insomnia, or symptoms of having a hard time getting to sleep, or having a hard time staying asleep, waking up a bunch in the night, waking up too early, feeling really tired during the day. I'm getting some ear signals, so I might switch my mics here. How's this? Better? Ooh, much better. Woo. Now I don't have to yell anymore. If you're having symptoms of having a hard time getting to sleep, staying asleep, waking up too early, feeling at least foggy during the day, wanting to take naps, being exhausted and thinking, I just slept all night, you could have insomnia, which technically can be its own sleep disorder, but it's also a great masquerader. People think they have insomnia, but really it may be some of the habits we have that we don't really realize affect our sleep that much. Or maybe some of us have an underlying sneaky sleep disorder, like that delayed sleep phase thing, being a night owl that might make you think you have sleep apnea. Or maybe you have sneaky sleep apnea, and you think that you have insomnia, that you're waking up in the middle of the night for no reason, but you're really waking up because your brain's trying to save you from running from that bear. Maybe you start thinking too much when you're trying to go to bed because your brain remembers from repeated nights of surviving that maybe it's a good time to think about things and get things in order before I go to bed. So I can say from personal experience that sleep disorders can be tricky, and you might not know how much they're bothering you, because I knew I didn't have great sleep, but I blamed it on myself because I wasn't even trying to go to sleep early enough. I was like that girl trying to learn calculus when I was in med school and residency. I was staying up too late. I had way too much to do and catch up on. And then more annoyingly, as soon as I tried to go to bed, that's when my brain decided to turn on and solve problems. Like, it was telling me, that's the only time you have alone to think. So I didn't think too much about that until my dentist informed me that I needed to pay him $1,000 or so for some dental work, all because I couldn't breathe through my nose well because of my allergies and a deviated septum. And so having my mouth open all the time helped bacteria that create cavities grow and flourish so that I had some pretty bad dental problems. And I ended up trying to fix my allergies and ultimately got a little surgery to get my nose straightened out. And I can breathe better, I can smell things a lot better, but the best thing was I started getting better sleep, especially over time. It was way easier to go to sleep. I wasn't waking up all the time, and I felt better during the day. I didn't really need coffee anymore. Well, that also made me listen to my children snoring a little differently. They were pretty loud, and I wondered, well, gosh, what if they have problems with their breathing at night? And sure enough, if you looked in the back of their throat, they had giant tonsils. Who could breathe past those very easily? They were working hard, both of them, and that was probably because of their allergies and genetics. So they ended up getting their tonsils removed, each of them, and not only did their snoring get better, but my son's hyperactivity got quite a bit better. I'm pretty sure his teachers liked him a lot better after that surgery, it seemed to me. And I didn't know that before, that most children who have sleep apnea or don't get enough sleep, they don't act sleepy, they bounce off the walls, over 80% of them. That's a sneaky symptom of not good sleep in kids. And then my daughter, she finally stopped wetting the bed when I was starting to wonder if or when that was going to happen. And again, another sneaky symptom of sleep apnea. Most people, they come in complaining of snoring if they have sleep apnea, or at least their bed partner complaining of snoring. But especially in people who are over 60, you might not snore much, but if you are waking up to use the restroom more than twice a night, that might be a clue that you have sleep apnea. Because you remember when Lisa was having you hold your breath and try hard, that kind of creates a lot of pressure in your chest. That kind of makes your heart swell with blood, and your brain thinks, I gotta get some of this fluid out of here. So we might have symptoms that we don't realize are because of our bad sleep. And then my husband, he was the last snorer standing, or I should say sleeping, and he did not complain of any symptoms. But you know what they say about happy wife, happy life. And I was elbowing him a lot just to save his life and tell him to turn on his side. That's why. And he finally underwent a sleep study at my begging, and turns out he doesn't have a big mouth after all. He has a mouth that looks like this, where when you look in there, all you see is a big tongue and the back of his throat, unlike this person who has a perfectly open airway. He's fine when he's up moving around and walking all day, but as soon as he lays down, his tongue becomes like a bathtub cork. That's much worse when he's laying on his back, so he goes like this. And I'm the one that was suffering for that. So he, over time, finally accepted that he needed to wear a CPAP, and I think he's much cuter with it on, and I sleep so much better. And he sleeps so much better. And you know, really, my whole family sleeps better after getting problems fixed that none of us knew we had for a long time. And that also changed the way that I started thinking about patients. It changed my whole career, because I started out as a psychiatrist, and then I went into geriatric psychiatry, trying to help older individuals, trying to find the right medications to help them with their mood and with their anxiety, and trying to stave off memory problems and prevent dementia, which we still don't really know how to prevent well. But we do know that getting better sleep helps your mood and helps dementia. So I couldn't help but want to become a sleep specialist. And boy, am I delighted that I don't have to give people pills that often anymore. I usually just have to give them air or oxygen, or maybe a little bit of education about how they might be able to get better sleep. So if you don't have sleep apnea or another sleep problem, what are some ways we can get better sleep? What can we tweak a little bit? Well, here's where I'm going to go back to something Lisa brought up about developed countries not getting enough sleep. We're not trying to sleep long enough in the first place some of the time. And part of that is something we can thank Thomas Edison for inventing the light bulb. Because we can tell on this map where the developed countries are. They are the places where we see that lights are clearly on well after it gets dark. We're busy, we have lots of stuff to do. We developed our nation this way, right? So we're all pretty familiar, I bet, with having our phones on and having maybe our computers on. Many of us may have a TV in our room. I hear a lot of the time, well, I fall asleep much better if I'm watching TV, which kind of makes sense. You can be paying attention to someone else instead of thinking too much. But there's another problem with that light besides that it's keeping us up with cool things to do. The problem is that the main signal to tell your brain that it's time to be awake and pay attention to what's going on around you is light. And not only light, it's blue light, the spectrum of light that comes from our electronic devices that is in fact the best at telling our brains that it should pay attention to what's going on around you. So when we have lights on, even if we fall asleep with lights on, our brain is still thinking part of it should be alert. It causes another problem, that the main signal for sleep is a chemical called melatonin. And melatonin is made and created in your brain during the day, but it doesn't get released to do its job until it's dark outside. Or dark around you. So if you're using even just the little light on your phone, that's preventing this melatonin from coming out. And that's important because melatonin is the signal that tells the parts of your brain that are very active during sleep that, hey guys, you guys better get in line and pay attention and get focused. It's time to do your job. And all you chemicals for being awake, it's time for you guys to go away. So if we don't give our brains time for this melatonin to come out, if we're turning off our TVs and our phones right before we go to bed, it's going to take us a little longer to get to sleep, and we're not going to get as good quality of sleep. So all of us could benefit from turning our computers and our phones off at least half an hour before going to bed. Now you might say, wait a minute, I read my Kindle before I go to bed, or that's when I play Candy Crush, or I have my TV on. You can't do that. Well, if you have to have your TV on, or your phone on, there are applications on your computer, on your phone, that you can download, often for free, that will change that light from a blue light, which is very activating, to a less obnoxious kind of red light spectrum. That's at least a good start. So, aside from turning our TVs off in our room and keeping the lights low, we want to look at other things in our environment. Is it quiet in our room? Do you have a comfortable bed? And what about the temperature? A lot of us have great thermostats, keep our house at 70 degrees all day and all night. The truth is, people, and most animals in fact, actually sleep better when it's cooler in the environment. And in fact, our body temperature dips a bunch in sleep. So think of a hibernating bear, right? They get really deep sleep when it's cold out. So we could all probably get better sleep if you lower your thermostat to closer to 65 degrees at night. Over time, you're going to get that better sleep quality. So those are a few things that we can tweak pretty easy. What about some of our other habits? Well, let's go to my favorite, which is coffee. I used to need coffee. I felt like a zombie without it until I got my nose fixed. Now I still like it in the morning. And coffee does help us feel more awake and alert. Why is that? Well, it goes back to what Russ talked about, this thing, adenosine. Remember that adenosine is that little chemical that builds up in our brain the longer we're awake and creates our sleep pressure that tells our brains, let's put the brakes on, let's slow down, you need to go to sleep soon. Well, caffeine does a great job of just kicking adenosine off its little receptors and blocking them so that our brain can ignore that sleep pressure so that you don't really notice your tiredness as much until that coffee starts wearing off after 5 or 6 hours. The problem is it lasts 10 to 12 hours. So even though you might be feeling a little tired after 5 or 6 hours, that's because it's not a substitute for sleep. It's still in your body 10 hours later. So if you have a cup of coffee afternoon, like I used to do, you still have caffeine in your body at 10, 11, midnight. Even if you're tired enough to go to sleep, your brain's still being tricked that you don't have that much sleep pressure. You don't have to get that deep a sleep. You might say, well, don't worry. I drink decaf afternoon. That might help a little bit, but decaf still has about 20% of the caffeine that coffee does. There's also sneaky caffeine. There's energy bars and different teas and chocolate. The tragedy, chocolate. It's hard to eat my chocolate dessert at night anymore, and it might not be enough to make you feel tired. That's what I call when you have coffee when you're tired and you feel wired and alert from the coffee, but underneath, you're still tired because that adenosine is still there, patiently waiting to remind you that you need to sleep. So if you're going to drink coffee or caffeine, we want to be careful about the timing and the amount. That will help. It's a good start. What about something else that does pretty much the opposite of coffee? Instead of keeping us awake, it can help us feel relaxed and sedated. That's alcohol. Alcohol is something that many of us might have heard is actually maybe good for us if we have a glass or two at night. But the thing is, alcohol sedates us,
which means it also sedates the parts of your brain that are supposed to be really active during sleep. So when they're supposed to be busy doing a bunch, cleaning up and helping you learn when you're asleep, they're sedated, they're not doing their job. So you're really not getting good quality sleep when there's alcohol in your system, even if you feel like it helps you get to sleep. Worse is alcohol on your brain is kind of like your finger pushing this Jack in the Box in the box. Everything's quiet and sedated until that crank is turned enough or until that alcohol wears off, where all of a sudden, pop, out he comes. Even if you're ready for it, it's a surprise. When that alcohol wears off, you're not sedated anymore. All those chemicals get to pop out, and it might be really hard for you to connect the idea that you waking up after midnight has anything to do with those few glasses of wine you had hours before. But it does, especially the more you drink. So, for the sake of your sleep, certainly, and other health things, it's helpful to drink less than a glass, or less than 3, let's say a glass or 2, and to get the party started a little earlier. Maybe have your glass of wine while you're planning to cook dinner, or while you're eating dinner, instead of within the 3 to 4 hours of going to sleep, so that you don't set yourself up for bad sleep and waking up feeling surprised. Well, so we've covered quite a few things here. We have trying to get to sleep on time and turning off the lights and temperature and caffeine and alcohol, and you're maybe saying, Shanna, I have tried all of these things and they don't work. I am not sleeping well. You may have feelings about sleep. It is very hard to find somebody who likes to do something that they don't feel like they're very good at or is not satisfying. So if you have had the occasion to not have very good sleep, you can start to not like sleep very much, or start to dread sleep, or start to expect that it's not going to be very good. And that can also cause a problem with your sleep. I used to be really good at clock watching, so good, my husband even got me a clock that splashed the time up on the ceiling, so I didn't have to look at my phone anymore. It would just tell me. It's great. The problem was, it didn't help, and that is summarized in this cartoon here. Insomnia sharpens your math skills because you spend all night calculating how much sleep you'll get if you fall asleep right now. Yeah, it's true. I remember Dr. Ramo said that happened to him too with his Fitbit. So it's really common. We are good at worrying during the day, but mental math and worrying is something that we do while we're awake. That means we're using parts of our brain that we use when we're awake. So it's not really going to help us get to sleep if we're using those part of our brains. So if you're trying these things, or you're worried about sleeping, you think it's not working, well, remember, we learn from habit and then sleeping on that habit. We have to do something over and over to make it stick. So if you have gone to bed easier with the TV on for years, it's probably going to be harder to sleep when you turn the TV off at first. But it's worth it if you stick with it. You can improve your sleep if you do little tweaks and stick with them. And if you're still worried about it or it's too hard, there are people that can help. There are ways to help shift the way you think about sleep, never mind all the habits. And maybe you weren't worried about sleep until you heard all the things that it can cause tonight. And maybe if you have some of those health problems that Lisa talked about, like diabetes and high blood pressure, if you've had a heart attack or have heart disease, if you've had a stroke, if you have memory problems or mood problems, if you're waking up to use the restroom 3 times a night, maybe it's worth talking to your doctor or seeing a sleep specialist to see if there's ways that we could improve your sleep, because it truly is important, a cornerstone of having a happy, healthy life. And with that, I want to look at this last slide that's going to look kind of like a snake oil sales from the 1800s, but it's true. The original cure-all, that's right, it's sleep. Scientists have discovered a revolutionary new treatment that makes you live longer. It enhances your memory and makes you more creative. It makes you look more attractive. It keeps you slim and lowers your food cravings. It protects you from cancer and dementia. It wards off the cold and flu. It lowers your risk of heart attacks, strokes, and even diabetes. And you'll feel happier, less depressed, and less anxious. Are you interested? Good, I want you to sleep on it. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. Thank you.
Dr. Shuttleworth is a professor of neuroscience at the university, and when I spoke to him about this subject, it really made me very excited. And he talked about the idea that we worry about two things right now, exercise and nutrition, and we emphasize that. And what he thinks is the part of this, the third part of the triangle really has to do with sleep and how important it is. So maybe have a few comments to make about that.
Well, thank you, Barry. Thank you very much for looking after us tonight. I think that's, I'm on the spot a little bit here, but I think this is something we think a lot about. We think with Russ Morton, we work together in the lab looking at brain function. And when you look at all of the things that happen during sleep, it's absolutely astonishing that it's the one easy thing to fix. It's the one easy thing to make a big change on that is very dramatic for all of these aspects of brain function and health. So when we think we have the Brain and Behavioral Health Institute at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center, and we think about what's the most important thing we could focus on tonight that would help all disorders, not just focusing on one disorder like Parkinson's or dementia or any one of these very important disorders, but what is something we could do that would cut across all those disorders? In working with our clinical colleagues, the answer we think is sleep. If we could just make a big difference in everybody's sleep across the state, that would do more than anything we could do tonight, or even for the next few years, to really improve the health of all New Mexicans. So we think this is the one thing we should really push and really spread the word on and get out to our community advocacy groups with different disorders, but also just increase general awareness with our kids, with our families, and we think that's where we should push. And we don't think it's more important than diet or exercise. You should keep doing those things, but adding sleep as the third pillar, we think, is the key.
And I think we have some questions. Russell, let me ask you a little bit more about the parts of the brain that are involved, because we talked about the midbrain and the prefrontal areas being very important in terms of addiction when we did a program like this. Where are the parts of the brain here? My understanding is that there is a place in the brain that if you ablate it, that you get rid of the circadian rhythm. And I'm just curious about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's specific regions in our brain that control that circadian rhythm that Lisa talked about. And there's actually a very few number of brain cells that actually regulate that circadian rhythm. And those studies have been done in animals, and yeah, they completely, if they remove that part of the brain or injure those neurons, the circadian rhythm is completely messed up. And animals don't have that ability. Even if the light cycle is kept the same of 12 hours dark and 12 hours light, they aren't able to adapt to any changes in that.
The other question that just came up is the role of melatonin and whether or not taking it, I've taken it for jet lag a couple of times and it didn't seem to work, but I'm curious if there's maybe I'm doing it wrong.
Well, I have a question. How long did you use that melatonin for jet lag, and when?
Well, like when I go to Europe,
Right.
I'll take it when I come home.
Well, that's a good question, and there's a couple things at play. Our body makes melatonin while we're awake. It's actually kind of made from the leftovers of all the chemicals that we're using while we're awake. So kind of the longer we've been awake, the more melatonin that we can build up for our brain to release at the right time. But if you have jet lag or something that throws off that usual rhythm, we can sometimes take melatonin in a pill form. There's a couple things about that. Melatonin is a vitamin and supplement, which technically is not regulated by the FDA for what's in that pill. So one of the questions is to ask yourself, what's good melatonin? You have to find a brand of vitamins that you trust to get melatonin that you know is melatonin. Another concept is, how long does it take melatonin to work? Some people are really lucky. They take it once and it clearly works. They have a stronger signal from that. Other people might have to take it for 3 or 4 days for it to change the way you're able to fall asleep or stay awake. And a lot of people don't know that either. So it can be more helpful for some people than others, and it depends on the kind of melatonin that you're taking.
You know, I really like your comment about the fact that it's an herbal medicine and there's absolutely no regulation, and so you have no idea what you're getting. You may not even be getting melatonin.
Right.
If you're interested in buying quality herbal medicines or supplements, there's an organization called medlab.org, which is a place that does very good testing on these supplements and provides you so that you don't get, I mean, some of them have rat feces in them, and there's just, you know, the supplement industry is horrible, and so this is a way, because melatonin obviously makes sense. Let me ask you about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very popular, and we're reading more and more about it. Can you explain what it is and where it fits in this?
Yes. So we know that cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is sometimes called CBTI, is actually more effective for treating insomnia than sleeping pills, because you're actually changing your behaviors, and so you get long-lasting benefit. Cognitive behavioral therapy involves really looking at what are the barriers that keep you from sleeping, sort of looking in part at those things that Shanna talked about, you know, what are your feelings about sleep, and you know, why do I avoid going to sleep? So those sort of things have to be overcome. And then there's also a lot of emphasis on sleep hygiene, which is good sleep habits. So what we know about CBTI is that it's very successful.
And there is, if you are interested, a group from Virginia that now has an online program, and you may have at the university, do you have anyone doing it there?
We don't, well, there are people at the university who do CBTI, but it's very hard to get an appointment with them. But there are lots of resources just online, and you can really put it in a search engine and find them. Some of them are free, some of them have a nominal cost, and you can just work through a program for CBTI online.
Yes. And as a psychiatrist, any more comments about that?
Well, I will say, as the psychiatrist in the group, I often get asked if I can do the CBTI or what I think of it. And it is really important to have the chance to stick through it, because it really takes about 8 to 12 sessions kind of in a row. Because first, you really have to take a good record of your sleep. So that starts with a sleep diary, and you're looking at when you're trying to go to sleep and what time you think you actually fall asleep, and when you're eating and when you're having caffeine. So the first few sessions is just laying the groundwork to kind of figure out how to record your habits. And then there's some sessions to look at, wow, what are some things we could tweak here? And then we move on to this idea of, you're saying you're only sleeping for 3 hours, but you're spending 10 hours in bed. We do not want to train you to sit in bed and not sleep. That is bad. We want your brain to learn to sleep. So then we work on this aspect of, well, I don't want to waste all your time in bed. If you're only sleeping 3 hours anyway, what time would you like to get up? 8 a.m., you say? Great. We're going to start off by telling you, don't even go to bed until 4 a.m. so that you're going to be so exhausted that you will crash. And then your brain will think, I can sleep when I'm in bed. And so you can't do this willy-nilly. You need a little push and encouragement, but there are very specific steps of watching, first learning, and then recording, and then tweaking, and then restricting, and then feeling bolder, and talking with someone every step of the way. And that's why it's great to have a person to do that with one-on-one, and why it's also very difficult to find that person
Well, that's great.
Yeah, I would love to see people 8 weeks in a row, but
So
That would be hard.
I've spent a fair amount of time looking at this program from Virginia, and I was into a television segment about it. There is a significant amount of research that suggests that it does work, and as you point out, there are probably many others, but I am impressed that they sent me their literature, and I talked to them, and it does sound like if anybody in the audience, and I'm sure there are plenty of you, have trouble sleeping and really want to look at this, because sleeping pills are terrible. They're really, every study that I'm aware of, you don't get smarter when you take those babies, even if you sleep. You're not going to do better on your calculus test. But I would look at it. Now let's turn to another subject, which a lot of people have, which is central sleep apnea. You might explain what that is and how that would be managed.
Okay, so an easy way to think about central sleep apnea versus obstructive sleep apnea is that obstructive sleep apnea is when you can't breathe, and central sleep apnea is when you won't breathe. So what's happening with central sleep apnea is the brain does not send a signal to initiate a breath. And when we see central sleep apnea on a sleep study, we look at these respiratory muscles, the muscles of breathing, and they're not even trying to breathe. And the things that cause central sleep apnea are wide and varied, but the big players are sleeping pills. No, I'm sorry, not sleeping pills, but pain pills, because pain pills, of course, are putting your brain to sleep a little bit. And the problem is that they put that part of your brain that tells you to breathe, they can put that part of your brain to sleep. So that's why you have to be very careful with dosing of pain pills. But also, then the other big cause of central sleep apnea is an imbalance in your carbon dioxide levels in your blood, and when your carbon dioxide levels get too low, then your brain says, hold your breath, don't breathe anymore, and let's wait for the carbon dioxide levels to build up again. What else would you say about central sleep apnea?
I think in central sleep apnea, from a cardiologist standpoint,
Yes.
it really has to do, probably 75 years ago, there were a couple of guys named Chains and Stokes, and they described Chain-Stokes respiration, which had to do with the fact that the circulation is so slow that by the time all of this gets to your brain, you've blown out all your carbon dioxide, and so your brain says you don't need any, and so you have this periodic breathing. And what I know is from heart failure patients, when we put them on evidence-based medicine that titrated at the proper levels, that a lot of times that central sleep apnea will go away when we fix their heart. But I'm sure there are other reasons for
yeah,
it.
I'll add on that actually. You described it great about kind of it's a slow signal. So you can imagine a good way to think about it is if you and a friend were playing a game where one of you was blindfolded and then the other one had to lead you through some course and tell you when to step over something or when to duck. Well, you better have a pretty good real-time signal here to tell you what to do at the right time. If your heart function is not good because it's beating randomly whenever it wants, as in, say, atrial fibrillation, or a problem with the rate, that can be a problem because it's making blood that's carrying that carbon dioxide and oxygen not come in solid spurts. Or if you are not squeezing much blood at the right time, if you have a heart failure, a weak heart squeeze, that's like your friend telling you, okay, duck under that door, but he tells you after you already bonked your head, or he tells you way too early, and you're ducking and there's nothing wrong, and you stand up just in time to bonk your head. This is that problem with your heart, is that by the time the signal gets to your brain, that was so 3 seconds ago. So when your brain says, oh my gosh, I need huge breaths, you take giant breaths. Well then, by the time that signal gets around saying you're good, you have plenty of oxygen, now you need to take breaths, but you don't, you hold your breath. So it's too slow a signal, and that can be treated with medications, or there's a special machine. If CPAP doesn't work, which it sometimes does, there are a few kinds of machines that kind of monitor if you're taking a breath. And if you don't take a breath, it will provide a breath for you.
And there are also diaphragmatic pacemakers that you can put
Yes,
in that will
yes.
stimulate the, if you don't take a breath, they come on. Just like your pacemaker, if your heart slows down, these babies will turn on. What about daylight savings time? What's going on in our brains?
It's killing me.
Obvious on everyone's mind, right? We're all struggling with that. The easiest way to think about it is any shift in your day-night cycle will be problematic for you to overcome. Now, an hour usually isn't too bad, but I know this week almost everyone in this room woke up and be like, oh my God, it is pitch black outside. It's hard to adjust to that. Just think about any time you fly across the country, that simple 2-3 hour time change can be devastating. You're up in the middle of the night, then you have to wake up the next morning, everyone's bright and cheery, you just went to bed an hour ago. Any shift in that light-dark cycle is hard to deal with. It's hard for your body to adapt.
Well, it's interesting that during the first day, especially spring forward, there were more auto accidents, more heart attacks, strokes during that period of time, something that was really fouled up. Let me ask you about heart attacks. We know that heart attacks are most frequent somewhere between 4 a.m. and until you get out of bed. And that, what do you think's going on that making that happen? Is that dreams, bad dreams, REM sleep?
Possibly. There's a couple of things going on. All of us have a spike in our cortisol, which is something that's we call it our stress hormone. And when we're sleeping, our cortisol is pretty low until our body knows, okay, we're going to have to pull out of this sleep thing and get launched for the day. So somewhere between 4 and 6 a.m., you're starting to ramp up and get ready to launch your cortisol. So that's one factor. Another factor is, what are you doing during sleep at that time? Well, we have a cycle of sleep at night, and it changes through the night. But as the night goes on, we have more and more of that dream sleep, REM sleep. It's very important. That's the part where your brain's kind of rerunning those learning paths. Well, we also dream during those times. We definitely don't want to act out our dreams. So our bodies are paralyzed, and that helps us not accidentally punch our bed partner or something. The problem is all those little muscles that help us breathe and those muscles in your neck are relaxed. So if you do have a problem with sleep apnea, it's worse then. So most people who have heart attacks in the morning, you probably know as a cardiologist, I think the most common time to have a heart attack is on Monday morning.
Right.
So if you're feeling like you don't want to go to work on Monday, you might have a good excuse. So part of it is definitely stress-driven. If you have sleep apnea, you're more likely to have a heart attack in the middle of the night or a stroke. That's the weird thing, is people without sleep apnea tend to have their strokes or heart attacks during the day because that's when our cortisol is higher and when we're stressed and running about. People with sleep apnea, they have them in the middle of the night because they're running that engine like they're running from a bear when it's supposed to be resting and catching up. So if you don't know if your family has a history of sleep apnea, you can wonder, do I have any family members that had a stroke in the middle of the night or that went to sleep and never woke up? That might be a red flag because sleep apnea is strongly genetic, and your parents, you can blame your parents.
And
if you
Lisa,
have sleep apnea.
one of the questions is about menopause. Why do menopause have so much trouble sleeping during that perimenopausal period?
Well, two things about menopause. One, women have the same rate of obstructive sleep apnea after menopause as men. But before menopause, women are protected against obstructive sleep apnea because of progesterone, which is a respiratory stimulant, so we breathe better while we're asleep. But then, after menopause, oh my gosh, the hot flashes are very disruptive to sleep, and let me just say from personal experience, very disruptive to sleep, and I almost can't think my way through it. I think it's important, yeah. I think it's important to treat those hot flashes if they really are disrupting your sleep because of, again, that impact on sleep and the sleep deficit. And there are lots of kinds of, all kinds of treatments
Does
for it.
hormone replacement therapy alleviate the,
It should, yeah. But if you're trying to avoid the hormone replacement therapy, then we know that a medication called gabapentin helps with hot flashes, and some of the antidepressants, even just very low doses, help to modulate that.
Keeping your room cool, remember, it'll help you sleep better even if you're not in menopause. So you can keep your covers on as long as
how about naps? Didn't mean to interrupt you. Well, are they
Naps.
good, bad? Does it
Naps.
foul up your circadian rhythm?
I was going to talk about naps, but it's a little complicated. Naps are tricky because they can be useful, but it depends. So if you're a child under 7, naps may be totally normal. If you're an adult over 60, naps may be totally normal because as we age, we have more awakenings at night, naturally, and we don't get as much deep sleep. And so you might have to spend a little more time in bed to get the right amount of sleep, and that can be hard to do all at night. Maybe your joints hurt at night, you're tossing and turning, you have to get up and use the restroom. So if you're needing to nap to get that 7 to 9 hours of sleep, it's not a bad idea. If you're a shift worker and you're only able to sleep 6 hours before your shift and you need to break up your sleep a little bit with naps, that's a good idea. If you're napping because you're not getting enough sleep, the reason they can get tricky is, remember, your brain is washed at night and that washes away that adenosine that builds up the sleep pressure and tells you need to sleep. Well, a nap is a mini wash. And if you're washing away some of that adenosine, then you're washing away some of that sleep pressure. So naps can help, but depending on the time and how long you nap, if it's too close to going to bed or it's too long, then it may make it harder to sleep at night. So it's something to be careful
What are
about.
your suggestions then for people out there thinking about taking a nap? Should they set the alarm?
Yes, they came up with the term power naps for pilots. No one liked the other terms they came up with. I don't remember what they were. They were kind of funny. But people felt weak unless they called them power naps. This idea of getting long enough sleep to get some restoration in that little mini wash, but not long enough to get into good deep sleep that's gonna kind of ruin your sleep pressure and sleep quality at night. So if you're gonna nap, you wanna try and keep it preferably under half an hour if you need, and as far away from your normal sleep times as possible. Really the best reason to nap is if you know you're not getting enough sleep at night because you're a shift worker or some other reason, you're a new parent or some cause like that, that it's worth taking naps, but it's really important to time them well.
Great. Well, thank you. I have one last question. Actually, I read recently, this may be totally wrong, that people who stop dreaming, it's an early sign of Alzheimer's. Is that right? And then to follow up on that question, you can just say yes or no. The follow-up, though, is what about weird dreams? What is the significance of that, and should we be worried when we have them?
I hate to hog the stage on this, but I kind of love that because everybody asks psychiatrists about dreams, right? And Freud had all kinds of ideas about dreams, and the truth is, yes and no. We don't know everything about dreams and why we dream and what's going on and how important. We used to think that dream sleep was the most important because, frankly, it's the one we figured out the most and seemed the most interesting at the time. And it is important, but what we do know about it is, one, it helps us kind of keep our memories solid. And the other thing that some people say from a learning standpoint and a psychiatric standpoint is that sleep is to help you remember and dreaming may be to help you forget. Not everything, but we cannot remember everything we do during the day. And everything we do during the day has feelings attached to it, whether we know it or not. And our brain is organized to try and stay organized like a filing cabinet. And sometimes that organization gets in the way of making special connections or being creative. And so we know of two things that happens in REM. We know that there's a lot we don't know, but two things is the part of your brain that organizes things and tries to make them fit in a certain file kind of backs up during REM so that you get to have a bunch of thoughts floating around that don't make sense well together. That might be why your dreams are so weird, because it's a chance for your brain to maybe be able to connect really different ideas or thoughts without the usual organization. So that's one thing. Maybe sparking some creativity and allowing you to learn in ways you can't when you're awake or in other stages of sleep, because remember, those nerves make connections, and it's easier to make connections to things that are close. But maybe dreaming helps us cast the net a little wider and make connections to things further away in our brains to understand bigger concepts. And the other part, I'll be quick about it, is emotions. We have a lot of emotions that we carry during the day, and dream sleep is one of the only times that we don't have much of the chemical norepinephrine or noradrenaline floating around. And that's one of our fight or flight chemicals. And a lot of the feelings we have about fear or anxiety, that's attached to norepinephrine. And so during dream sleep, we don't have that, and we know that because norepinephrine is what turns dreams off. So when there's no norepinephrine around, that's when you get to kind of rehash what you've done through the day and present this to your brain of, you know, here's that scary thing that now when it's not so scary, when it doesn't have that norepinephrine attached. And then your brain gets to decide, do I still want to keep this or do I get to discard it? And so we know that if people get better dream sleep, a lot of them have better emotional health because they get to chew through that emotional baggage a little better.
So that's great information. I think makes me feel better that I dream all the time.
It's okay if you don't remember your dreams either.
Well,
you might just not remember
I would
them.
like to thank this fabulous panel because I think that we've got some three experts here. They're great. Well, I also want to thank Andy Watson and the Albuquerque Academy for letting us do this so many times with so many fascinating people. Andy, I really appreciate your doing it. And Lori Peterkin, who is here, who's been responsible for setting up all these brilliant programs, I thank you. So what I think you heard tonight, and when I talked to them earlier today, I asked the question is, where is sleep in relationship to, say, cardiology? And my conclusion is that sleep is about 1960. We're just beginning to understand it. But what is clear as you look through the clouds and look at the research that's coming out, that your brain has an enormous impact on so much of your body, your cardiovascular system, insulin resistance, diabetes, and heart disease, cancer, et cetera. And it is important. We simply don't know. All we have right now are, when you place the 10 things that sleep does for you, those are associations. And most of it makes sense, and it seems logical, but we need a lot more data to say that if we do those things, we'll actually see the changes. But I think it's very exciting as you watch and you read the literature and you read the newspapers now about sleep, you'll understand why everyone here is so excited about it and why it is so important for health. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for the University of New Mexico.